A dying man gave Garrett Thorne a wife. But this wasn't a gift. It was a curse wrapped in a promise. And what Garrett was about to discover about this woman, this stranger named Celeste, would tear down every wall he'd built around his heart and burn his entire world to the ground. It all started with the sound of a horse screaming. Garrett was splitting logs, the axe a familiar weight in his hands, the rhythm the only friend he'd known for 8 long years. Then the crack of timber, the awful final sound of a life ending, echoed through the canyon. He found the man 20 feet from his cabin door, a bloody handprint smeared on the dirt where he'd tried to crawl closer. His breath was a ragged whisper of sand and blood. Garrett knelt. He'd seen death before, but not like this. Not this desperate. The man's eyes, already filmed with the gray of the end, locked onto him. "Please," he gasped, his fingers latching onto Garrett's shirt with the strength of a ghost. "My wife, Celeste." Garrett scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just rock, scrub, and the kind of soul-crushing silence that had driven other men mad. He liked the silence. It didn't ask questions. "Where is she?" Garrett asked, his voice rough from disuse. The man's grip tightened, a spasm of pure will. "Coming. Behind me. An hour, maybe 2. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, a dark red flower blooming on his lips. "Promise me." Garrett tried to pull away. He was a loner, a hermit. He talked to his horses, ate beans from a can, and watched the sun die every evening in a blaze of orange and purple, completely alone. He'd chosen this life. He didn't want complications. He didn't want promises. "I don't know anything about taking care of a woman," he grunted. "Promise me." The man's voice was a saw blade on bone. He was begging, not for his own life, but for hers. And that scared Garrett more than anything. "You'll take care of her. She's got nowhere else to go." No one. The desperation in the man's eyes was a hook, and Garrett could feel it digging into him. "She's special," the man choked out, his body starting to shudder. "But she's dangerous, you understand? People want to hurt her because of what she knows." What she knows. The words hung in the cold mountain air. A chill, entirely separate from the wind, crawled up Garrett's spine. He wasn't just being asked to shelter a widow. He was being asked to step into the middle of a war he knew nothing about. The stranger, with his last ounce of strength, fumbled inside his jacket. He pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch, pressing it into Garrett's hand. "Give this to her," he whispered, his voice fading. "She'll know what it is. And whatever you do, don't let her open it. Not until she's ready to tell you the truth." Garrett felt the weight of the pouch. Something hard, metallic, and complex was inside. It felt like a secret. "What truth?" he demanded, but the stranger's eyes were already empty. His hand fell away from Garrett's shirt, and he was gone. He was just a body, a dead man who had just shackled Garrett to a ghost of a woman with a dangerous secret. And then he heard it, the faint, rhythmic beat of hoofs on the hard-packed earth. Someone was coming, riding fast. Garrett stood, the pouch clutched in his hand, the dead man's promise a brand on his soul. He had just inherited a woman he'd never met and a secret that had already cost one man his life. As the sound of the horse grew louder, a cloud of dust rising on the horizon, he knew his 8 years of peace were over. The question was, would this woman, Celeste, be his salvation or his executioner? She emerged from the dust like an avenging angel, riding a jet-black mare that moved with a restless, nervous energy. Her dark hair was a wild banner in the wind, her dress torn at the hem and stained with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. But it was her eyes that made Garrett's hand drift toward the pistol on his hip. They were the green of a storm-tossed sea, and they held no fear. None at all. She saw him, a stranger with an axe, standing over the body of her husband, and she didn't even flinch. She swung down from the horse with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked at the body, then at him, her expression as hard and unreadable as the mountains around them. "Is he dead?" Her voice was calm. Too calm. It was a cold splash of water in the face, and it made Garrett's blood run cold. "Yeah," Garrett said, taking a half step back. "Maybe 10 minutes ago." She knelt beside the body, placing a hand on the dead man's chest. For a moment her lips moved, whispering words too quiet for Garrett to hear. A prayer, a promise, a curse. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and fixed those unsettling green eyes on him. "Did he tell you about me?" "He said you were his wife," Garrett answered, his thumb hooked over his belt, inches from his gun. The leather pouch in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through his pants. "Said you needed protection?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Not fear, recognition. "What else?" Garrett decided to lay his cards on the table. "He said people want to hurt you, because of what you know." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "And he said you were dangerous." A laugh escaped her lips, but it was a bitter, broken sound with no humor in it. Henry always did have a gift for understatement. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, to the new dust clouds that were now visible in the distance, smaller but moving with purpose. "How many men can you handle, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her eyes snapping back to his. The question caught him off guard. She knew his name, but how? He hadn't told the dying man his name. A new, more potent wave of alarm washed over him. Who was this woman? "How do you know my name?" Henry described the cabin, said a man named Thorne lived here. A loner, kept to himself. She took a step closer, her eyes scanning his face, his posture, sizing him up. "He was hoping you were the kind of man who didn't scare easy." The dust clouds were getting closer. He could make out individual riders now. 4. No, 5. "How many should I be worried about?" he asked, his mind racing. "All of them," she said flatly. Without another word, Celeste walked to her horse, pulled a long rifle from its saddle scabbard, and checked the chamber with a practiced efficiency that made his skin crawl. This wasn't the movement of a grieving widow. It was the movement of a soldier. "They've been on our trail for 3 days," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Henry thought we could lose them in the Badlands. He was wrong." The hoofbeats were a steady drum beat now, a funeral march. "What do they want?" Garrett demanded. Celeste was already moving toward the meager cover of his cabin, her rifle held at the ready. She glanced back at him over her shoulder, and for the first time, just for a split second, he saw it. Beneath the steel, beneath the ice, there was a flicker of genuine, gut-wrenching fear. "The same thing men like them always want." Her voice was a ragged whisper. "To own me." Garrett felt the dead man's promise weighing him down like a tombstone. Henry had said she was special. He'd said she was dangerous. Watching the way she moved, the way she scanned the terrain like a hawk, Garrett was starting to realize that she was something more. She was a survivor, and he had just been drafted into her war. "There's a root cellar," he said, his voice a low growl. "Behind the cabin, it's deep. You can hide there while I handle this." "I don't hide." Celeste braced the rifle against a porch post, her eye already sighting down the barrel. "And neither should you, unless you want to watch them burn down everything you've spent the last 8 years building." The riders crested the last hill, 5 of them, dressed in long dusters, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. They moved like a pack of wolves, confident and deadly. "They'll want to talk first," Celeste said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "They always do. They'll try to bribe you, try to convince you I'm not worth dying for." She took a deep, steadying breath. "They'll offer you money to hand me over." She turned her head and looked at him. Really looked at him, as if seeing past the beard and the solitude, right into the broken parts of his soul. "Then we'll find out what kind of man you really are. Garrett Thorne." The lead rider raised a hand, and the group halted 50 yards out. He was a tall man, with silver hair that shone in the afternoon sun, and a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. When he smiled, it looked like a wound opening. "Afternoon, friend," his voice boomed across the clearing. It was a voice used to giving orders and being obeyed. "Name's Clayton Morse. We're looking for a woman. Might have passed this way. Dark hair, green eyes, traveling with a fella named Henry Walsh." Garrett stepped forward from the cover of the cabin, his own rifle held loosely in his hands. He could feel Celeste at his back, a silent, deadly shadow. "Haven't seen anyone like that," Garrett lied. The lie felt clumsy and weak in his mouth. Morse's smile widened. It didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. Now that's funny, Morse said, his voice dripping with mock disbelief. Because we followed their tracks right to your doorstep. He gestured to the ground, where the prints were plain as day. And unless I'm mistaken, that's Henry Walsh's body lying right there next to your woodpile. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken threats. Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Celeste whispered one word, a word that changed everything. Bureau. Garrett's blood turned to ice. Bureau. Federal marshals. He's a marshal, she breathed. The others are bounty hunters. He's deputized. This wasn't just a posse. This was the law. And he was standing on the wrong side of it, protecting a woman he didn't know from a federal marshal. The promise he'd made to a dead man suddenly felt like a suicide pact. That woman, Morse continued, his voice hardening, his hand now resting on the butt of his holstered pistol, is wanted for murder, multiple murders in fact, killed a territorial judge in Santa Fe, shot him down in his own courtroom. Murder! The word struck Garrett like a physical blow. He glanced back at Celeste. Her face was a mask of stone. There's a $5,000 reward for her capture, Morse called out, his eyes boring into Garrett. Dead or alive, it makes no difference to us. $5,000. It was a fortune. More money than Garrett had seen in a decade. Enough to buy a real ranch, with fertile land and a river. Enough to hire hands. Enough to wash away the last 8 years of sweat and solitude and start over. All he had to do was step aside. What murders? Garrett called back, stalling for time, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He could feel Celeste tensing behind him, could feel the heat radiating from her, the silent plea for him to believe her, not them. She killed Judge Morrison, Morse shouted, then gunned down 2 deputies who tried to arrest her. Did it in cold blood? A woman like that, she's poison. Not the kind of person you want around decent folk. Garrett's world was spinning. Henry's words echoed in his mind. People want to hurt her because of what she knows. Was this what he meant? Or was the truth simpler, uglier? Was Celeste just a cold-blooded killer? She's lying to you right now, Thorne. Morse's voice was like a whip crack. Whatever sob story she's fed you, it's a lie. That's what they do. They lie and they manipulate until they get you killed right alongside them. Garrett could feel the weight of Morse's stare, the pressure of his choice, the 5 armed men on horseback, the $5,000, the dead body of a man who'd made him promise. He turned to Celeste, his eyes demanding the truth. Her voice was low, for his ears only, but it burned with a cold, righteous fire. The judge was corrupt. He was selling verdicts to the highest bidder. I had proof, irrefutable proof. Then why not turn him in? Garrett whispered back, his gut twisting. Because he owned the whole territory, she hissed, her eyes blazing with a pain so deep it was terrifying. He owned the sheriff, the deputies, everyone. I tried the law. The law failed. The only justice left in that town was at the end of my gun. Vigilante justice. He looked from her fierce, desperate face to the cold, confident smirk on Marshal Morse's. One of them was lying, and choosing wrong would mean his life. Time's up, friend, Morse shouted, his patience clearly gone. Give us the woman. The $5,000 is yours, a reward for being a good citizen. Refuse, and you'll be obstructing a federal marshal, and we'll have to assume you're her accomplice. He drew his pistol. The 4 men beside him did the same. The clicks of 5 hammers being cocked were the loudest sound Garrett had ever heard. What would you do? Trust the woman who admits she's a killer, or the man who wears a badge? Who do you believe? Garrett Thorne had to decide, and he had to decide right now, because the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and he had a terrible feeling he wasn't going to live to see it set. He made his choice. He raised his rifle, the worn stock settling into his shoulder like an old friend. She's not here, he shouted, the lie feeling like sandpaper in his throat. Whoever you were tracking must have kept on riding. Marshal Morse's smile vanished. His face became a mask of cold, professional fury. I was hoping you weren't a fool, Thorne. He raised his hand, a silent command. The world exploded. The first bullet splintered the porch post inches from Garrett's head, showering his face with sharp slivers of wood. He dove back, hitting the rough planks of the porch hard as a second shot whizzed through the air where he'd just been standing. Celeste was already moving. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She was a whirlwind of deadly grace, her rifle barking twice in quick succession. One of the bounty hunters cried out, clutching his shoulder as he pitched sideways off his horse. "The root cellar!" Garrett yelled over the gunfire. "Now!" "No!" she shouted back, firing again from behind the cover of a thick wooden water trough. "They'll trap us, burn us out. We have to hold them here." Another bullet slammed into the cabin wall near Garrett's ear. He scrambled behind his chopping block, the same block where he'd spent his morning in blissful, ignorant peace. That life was gone. It had been shattered by a dying man's last words. 5 guns against 2. The odds were suicidal. But then he saw it. Celeste wasn't just shooting. She was fighting a different kind of war. Her shots weren't aimed to kill. They were precise, calculated. A shot into the dirt in front of a horse to make it rear. A shot that ricocheted off a rock near a man's head to make him duck. She was disrupting their attack, sowing chaos, forcing them to stay at a distance. She wasn't trying to win, she was buying time. "What are you waiting for?" he yelled during a brief, terrifying lull in the shooting. "Back up," she called back, her hands a blur as she reloaded her rifle with impossible speed. "Henry sent word ahead, before we were ambushed. If we can hold out for another 10 minutes..." "Back up from who?" Garrett shouted, his mind reeling. Who could possibly be coming to help a wanted murderer? "People who know the truth," she yelled just as the bounty hunters renewed their assault. "People who know what Judge Morrison and Marshal Morse were really doing." Her next shot was a masterpiece of cold calculation. It struck one of the horses in the leg. The animal screamed and went down, trapping its rider underneath. 1 gun out of the fight. Morse was screaming orders, his voice raw with rage. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected a simple rancher to roll over. He hadn't expected a warrior. Morse wasn't just a marshal, Celeste explained in short, breathless bursts between shots. He was Morrison's enforcer. Their operation? They ran that whole territory. Fake trials, bribes, protection money. Anyone who stood up to them, anyone who tried to talk, they just disappeared. The leather pouch in Garrett's pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "Give this to her. She'll know what it is." "The pouch," he said, the realization dawning on him. "What's in it?" "Morrison's personal ledger," she grunted, firing again. "Every bribe he ever took, every verdict he ever sold, every murder he ordered Morse to cover up. Henry stole it from the judge's safe the night I was supposed to stand trial. It's the one thing that can bring down their entire network. That's why they can't let us live." Proof. He was holding the proof. The reason Henry died. The reason 5 men were trying to kill them. It wasn't just about Celeste anymore. This was bigger. So much bigger. And then a new sound joined the cacophony of gunfire. A low, distant rumble. At first, Garrett thought it was thunder. But it wasn't. It was hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Coming fast from the east. Morse heard it too. He and his men exchanged nervous glances. Their window of opportunity was closing. "Last chance, Thorne," Morse bellowed, his voice strained. "Give me the woman and the ledger. I'll let you walk away." The approaching riders were visible now, a dark line on the horizon, growing larger by the second. But Garrett couldn't tell who they were. Friends? Or more of Morse's men? Was their salvation coming? Or was their doom? Celeste gave Morse his answer. She sighted carefully and put a bullet through the brim of his hat, sending it spinning off his head. And that's when everything changed. Morse screamed in pure animalistic rage. He made a sharp, brutal signal to his men. Their tactics shifted instantly. They stopped shooting at Garrett and Celeste. They started shooting at everything else. Bullets ripped through the thin walls of the cabin. They shattered the windows he'd painstakingly installed. They splintered his water barrels, sending precious water gushing into the dust. They tore through his small supply shed, the one filled with enough food and tools to last him the winter. And then they started shooting his horses. Garrett watched in horror as his 2 geldings, his only companions for 8 long years, screamed and fell in a tangle of thrashing legs in their corral. They weren't trying to capture Celeste anymore. They weren't trying to get the ledger. They were trying to erase him, to punish him for making the wrong choice, to burn his entire world to ash and cinders right in front of his eyes. The approaching riders were almost there. He could hear their calls, the thunder of their charge. But as Garrett Thorne watched his life's work being systematically destroyed, a terrible thought struck him. What if Celeste was wrong? What if the approaching riders weren't her backup? What if they were Morse's? The riders who thundered into the clearing weren't bounty hunters. They wore the tarnished silver badges of territorial marshals, real ones. Their leader was a man with a face like a worn leather saddle and eyes that had seen too much. He reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the dead body, the slaughtered horses, the bullet-riddled cabin, and landing on Clayton Morse with a look of pure disgust. Federal Marshal Clayton Morse, the leader's voice cracked like a whip. By the authority of the territorial governor, you and your men are under arrest. Morse's face went white with shock and disbelief. Davidson, what in the hell is this? I'm in pursuit of a fugitive. The only fugitive I see here is you, Clayton, Marshal Davidson said, swinging down from his horse, his hand resting on his gun. We've been investigating your little operation for months. Your whole house of cards is coming down. Garrett and Celeste slowly rose from their cover, rifles still at the ready, watching this new drama unfold. Garrett's mind was spinning. An investigation? That's impossible, Morse snarled. No one talked. Oh, someone talked, all right, Davidson said with a grim satisfaction. Judge Morrison. He sang like a canary right before he died. Died? The word hit Garrett like a stray bullet. He looked at Celeste. Her face was a mask of confusion. If Morrison was already dead, then what was this all for? Morrison had a massive heart attack 3 days ago, Davidson explained, his eyes fixed on Morse. Right after we brought him in for questioning, but not before he gave us a full confession. The bribes, the fixed trials, the murders you carried out for him. He gave us everything. Celeste lowered her rifle slightly. Then, why were they still chasing us? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Morse let out a bitter, desperate laugh. Because dead men can't testify in court, can they? He glared at Celeste, his face a twisted mask of hatred. But ledgers can, and so can witnesses. You, girl, you're the last loose end, the only one left who could tell a jury just how deep the rot goes. The leather pouch in Garrett's pocket suddenly felt like a hot coal. It wasn't just a record of past crimes. It was a key that could unlock the prison cells for dozens of powerful men. It's over, Clayton, Davidson said, his voice low and final. Stand down. For a moment, it looked like Morse might surrender. He looked at the dozen marshals surrounding him, at Davidson's steady gaze, and his shoulders slumped. Then his eyes darted to Celeste, to Garrett, and his face hardened with a suicidal rage. He was a cornered animal, and he decided he would rather die than be caged. He went for his gun. The ensuing gunfight was a short, brutal, deafening roar. When the smoke cleared, 2 more of the bounty hunters were dead on the ground. The other 2 had their hands in the air, and Clayton Morse was on his knees clutching a shattered arm, his pistol lying in the dust beside him. The fight was over. Davidson walked toward Garrett and Celeste, his eyes showing a weary respect. Henry Walsh was a brave man, he said. He got a message to us before Morse caught up to him. Told us what he had. He died getting that ledger to safety. Where is it? Garrett reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly. He pulled out the heavy leather pouch and handed it to the marshal. The promise he had made to a dying man was finally fulfilled. Davidson opened it. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat columns of names, dates, and figures. It was a meticulous record of a decade of corruption. My God, Davidson breathed, flipping through the pages. There's enough here to bring down half the men running this territory. Morrison wasn't the only judge on his payroll. He looked at Celeste, his expression softening. It's over, miss. The murder charges against you are being dropped. We have Morrison's confession that he ordered his deputies to kill you, and you acted in self-defense. He then looked at the smoking ruins of Garrett's ranch. As for the damages here, The governor's office will see to it you're compensated for your losses." "I don't want their money," Garrett said, his voice flat. His home was destroyed. His horses were dead. 8 years of his life, gone. But he had kept his promise. And standing there next to this impossible, dangerous woman, he realized something strange. He didn't feel empty. Celeste walked over to where Henry's body lay. She knelt, just as she had before, and whispered something to the still air. When she stood up this time, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. It was the first real crack he'd seen in her armor. "He was a good man," she said quietly to Garrett. "He deserved better than to die in the dirt." "He got something better," Garrett replied, his gaze meeting hers. "He got justice." As Davidson's men hauled Morse and his surviving lackeys away, a profound silence fell over the canyon. It was just Garrett and Celeste, standing amidst the wreckage. The war was over. The bad guys were gone. But now the hardest part began. What do you do with a woman who has just lost the only person she had left? A woman who had killed for justice and stared death in the face without blinking? A woman who was now looking at him with those stormy green eyes, as if he was a puzzle she was trying to solve? The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the broken timbers of his cabin. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice soft. "About your home, your horses, all of this." Garrett looked at the splintered wood, the shattered glass, the dead animals. "It's just stuff," he said, but the words felt hollow. "It can be rebuilt." "Not by me." She turned and walked toward her black mare, her movements stiff and mechanical. "I need to go. There will be more questions, more trials. Men who were part of Morrison's network will want revenge." "Where will you go?" he asked. She shrugged, a gesture of profound weariness that seemed to pull her whole body down. "California, maybe. Mexico. Somewhere they don't know my name. Somewhere I can just disappear." She put her foot in the stirrup, ready to mount, ready to ride away and leave him alone in the ruins. "Thank you, Garrett Thorne," she said, pausing to look at him one last time, "for keeping Henry's promise, for choosing to trust a stranger." And in that moment, Garrett felt something inside his chest crack wide open. 8 years of solitude, 8 years of building walls to keep the world out, and they all came crumbling down. He had chosen this quiet life to avoid pain, to avoid complications. But watching her, poised to leave, he was struck by a devastating realization. It hadn't been peace he'd found in these mountains. It had been emptiness. "Stay," he said. The word was a rough, desperate sound torn from his throat. Celeste froze, her hand still on the saddle. "What?" "Stay," he repeated, taking a step toward her. He gestured vaguely at the wreckage around them. "Help me rebuild. I could use the help. The company." He looked her straight in the eye. "And you look like someone who's tired of running." For a heartbeat, a flicker of raw, unguarded hope illuminated her face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a sad, weary practicality. "You don't know me, Garrett," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know the things I've done, the woman I've had to become." She looked toward the spot where Henry's body had been. "I killed 3 men. Maybe they deserved it, but I still pulled the trigger. I'm not the kind of woman who builds homes. I'm the kind of woman who burns them down." "Henry didn't think so," Garrett insisted. "Henry was a dying man," she countered, her voice sharp with pain. "Dying men see what they want to see." Garrett closed the distance between them, stopping right beside her horse. He could see the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the immense weight she carried all alone. "What did you whisper to him?" he asked softly. "Back when he was gone. What did you say?" Her breath hitched. For a long moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I promised him I'd find a way to live again. To really live. Not just survive." She shook her head, a gesture of futility. "But I don't think I remember how." "Then learn," Garrett said, his voice gentle but firm. He reached up and placed his hand over hers on the reins. Her skin was cold. "We'll both learn. Together." They stood like that, frozen in a tableau of possibility, the lone rancher in the ruins of his life, and the fugitive warrior at the end of her war. Both of them broken, both of them survivors, both of them standing on the edge of a new terrifying beginning. "I don't know how to be anyone's wife," she whispered, her gaze fixed on his hand covering hers. Garrett felt the corner of his mouth twitch upwards in the first real smile he'd felt in 8 years. "I don't know how to be anyone's husband." He squeezed her hand gently. "Seems to me we're starting even." Celeste looked from their joined hands to the vast empty horizon, where the sun was beginning to bleed color across the sky. Out there was the life she knew, running, hiding, sleeping with one eye open. And here was something else, something terrifying, something that might just be hope. "If I stay," she said, her voice careful, deliberate, "it won't be as Henry's widow. It'll be as me. Celeste. Just Celeste." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. Slowly, as if testing the ground beneath her feet, she took her foot out of the stirrup and dismounted. She stood before him, no longer a fugitive, no longer a widow, just a woman who had forgotten how to stand still. "Then I guess," she said, a faint, fragile smile gracing her lips, "we'd better start planning this rebuild." But as they stood together in the fading light, surrounded by the ghosts of what they had lost, Garrett knew the real rebuilding had nothing to do with lumber and nails. It was about rebuilding trust from betrayal, hope from ashes, and a future from two shattered pasts. And that was a foundation that could break with the slightest wrong step. 3 hours later, the world was painted in shades of orange and deep purple. A small fire crackled, a tiny beacon of warmth against the encroaching dark. They sat on opposite sides of it, sharing the last of Garrett's coffee from a dented tin pot, the silence between them no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the quiet hum of possibility. "We'll need lumber first," Garrett said, sketching a rough outline of a cabin in the dirt with a stick. "Nearest mill is a 2-day ride. They'll deliver, for a price." "What price?" Celeste asked, her eyes on the flames. "If you're thinking about that reward money, I meant what I said. I don't want it." "I wasn't," Garrett said, his voice firm. "I've got some savings buried. Enough to get started." She looked up, studying his face in the flickering firelight, her expression serious. "Why are you doing this, Garrett? You could have taken the $5,000. Started fresh somewhere else. Somewhere without a burned-down ranch and a woman with a past like mine." Garrett stared into the fire, watching the embers dance and die. He was a man who'd learned to hoard his words, to keep his thoughts locked away. But she deserved the truth. "You want the real truth?" he asked. "Always." He took a deep breath. 8 years ago, I came to these mountains because I was running too. Not from the law, from everything else, from people, from expectations, from the way life just keeps finding new ways to crush you. He finally met her gaze across the flames. "I thought being alone was the answer. I thought if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't get hurt anymore." "What changed?" she asked softly. "You did," he admitted, the words feeling strange and true in his mouth. "Watching you today, watching you fight for something bigger than yourself, watching you choose the truth even when it costs you everything." He shook his head, a wry, self-deprecating smile on his lips. "It made me realize I wasn't avoiding pain by living out here alone. I was just avoiding life." Celeste poked at the fire with a long stick, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the night sky. "Life has a way of finding you anyway," she murmured. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They lapsed into a comfortable silence again, the fire crackling, the stars beginning to appear in the vast dark canvas above. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "I was married before Henry." Garrett stayed silent, knowing this was a door she had to open on her own. "His name was Thomas," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the fire, as if she were seeing ghosts in the flames. "We had a small farm near Tucson. Nothing special, but it was ours. We were happy." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It recited history of a life that belonged to someone else. Morse's men, they killed him. He'd witnessed one of Morrison's kangaroo court trials, saw the money change hands. He was going to testify against them. She took a shaky breath, but her voice remained steady. They burned our farm, killed our livestock. They left me with nothing but his blood on my hands. The pieces clicked into place for Garrett. The cold fury, the deadly skill with a rifle, the willingness to stand against impossible odds. It wasn't just about justice, it was about revenge. So you went after Morrison yourself, he said, not as a question, but as a statement. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Not at first. At first I was a good little widow. I tried to do it the right way. I went to other judges, other marshals, anyone who would listen. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a cold, ancient anger. You know what they told me? They told me grief makes women say crazy things. They told me to go home and pray. Her gaze was sharp as a shard of glass. So I stopped asking for their permission. I stopped believing in their kind of justice. That's who I am, Garrett. That's the woman you're offering to rebuild with. Someone who took the law into her own hands because the law's a lie. The weight of her confession settled between them. He understood now why Henry had called her dangerous, not because she was evil, but because she was something far more terrifying to men like Morrison. She was a consequence. I'm not asking you to change who you are, Garrett said finally, his voice low and steady. I'm just asking you to stay. But as the great tapestry of stars spread across the sky, a nagging doubt crept into Garrett's mind. Could two people, broken so completely by the world, ever truly build something whole together? Or were they just two ghosts, trying to build a house in a graveyard? The morning brought a surprise. Marshal Davidson returned, not alone, but with a supply wagon and two grim-faced men who looked more like carpenters than lawmen. Official compensation, Davidson announced, hopping down from the wagon seat. From the territorial governor himself. Lumber, tools, enough provisions to get you through the winter. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat. And this. Celeste took it, her hand steady. Inside was an official pardon, signed and sealed, and a letter of commendation for Garrett. It's really over, she breathed. Completely, Davidson confirmed. Morrison's ledger implicated 12 other officials. We're rolling up the entire network. You two paid a hell of a price for it. We both did, Garrett said, his eyes meeting Celeste's. After the marshal left, they stood amidst the stacks of fresh-cut lumber and crates of supplies. The reality of their decision was suddenly tangible, smelling of sawdust and new beginnings. Where do we start? Celeste asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Garrett picked up a heavy beam of timber, feeling its solid, reassuring weight. The foundation, he said. You always start with the foundation. They worked, and in the shared labor, something miraculous happened. They began to find a rhythm. Celeste was a natural with tools, her hands quick and sure. Garrett found himself watching her, the way the sun caught the stray strands of her dark hair, the way she would bite her lip in concentration. They talked, not about the past, but about the future, about the placement of windows, the height of the roof, the direction the porch would face to best catch the sunset. You're staring, she said one afternoon, not even looking up from a board she was sanding smooth. Just thinking, he replied, setting down his hammer. Henry was right. You are special. He saw her hand still. Not because you're dangerous, but because you know how to fight for what's important. She finally looked up, her green eyes meeting his across the frame of their half-built home. And what's important to you, Garrett Thorne? The question hung in the air between them, more important than any wall they could build. 8 years of silence had taught him to be careful with words, but looking at her now, dust on her cheek and hope in her eyes, he knew it was time to stop being careful. This, he said simply, gesturing to the new life rising around them, building something real, with someone who understands that the best things always come with a price. She walked toward him, closing the space between them until he could see the tiny flecks of gold in her green eyes. I can't promise it will be easy, Garrett, she said, her voice low and serious. I have nightmares. I wake up reaching for a gun that isn't there. Sometimes the world goes quiet, and I might forget how to talk for days. He reached out and gently brushed the sawdust from her cheek. And I've spent 8 years talking only to horses. I might forget how to listen. A slow smile spread across his face. Sounds like we're a perfect match. When he kissed her, it was hesitant at first, then deep and sure. It tasted of sawdust and coffee and second chances. It was a promise not to a dying man, but to each other. A promise to build something strong enough to withstand the ghosts. 6 months later, the house stood finished, bathed in the golden light of an autumn afternoon. It was bigger than the old cabin, with wide windows and a porch built for two. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. They had married in the spring, with Marshall Davidson as their only witness. The past was still there, a quiet shadow in the corners of their lives, but it no longer had the power to haunt them. They had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about building a present so full of life, it left no room for the ghosts to linger. As they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the familiar peaks, Celeste leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what Henry would think of all this?" Garrett wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think he'd be proud," he said. "He asked me to take care of you, but I think what he really wanted was for both of us to learn how to take care of each other." In the quiet twilight of the mountains, with their new life spread out before them, that felt like the only promise that truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of the Wild West. And click the video on your screen right now, because the next story is waiting, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next.